In our continuous series highlighting the fantastic working class progressive women running for Congress that are matriarch candidates, we lead you to Washington's 6th District, which has a primary on August 4th. Rebecca Parson is running for Congress in that district. She is bringing the socialism to the district. She's fiery on Twitter. We love what she has to say, and my God, if she gets to Congress, I just can't wait to see how she blows things up in a figurative way. So Rebecca, thank you so much for joining.
Hi, Nomiki. Thanks so much for having me. Excited.
So, okay, the general question is, why did you decide to run?
Well, I'm running because the 6th District has been blue for 55 years, yet we have the 11th most conservative Democrat in the House representing us, and that has a real impact on the quality of life for people in the district. Now, he's been in office for quite some time now, yet we have homelessness on the rise. We have 24% of the district on Social Security, yet he signed a letter calling for Social Security cuts, supporting Mitt Romney's plan to do that. We have people who are, they can barely afford the rent if they even can. People who can't get a good job. There's a big part of my district that used to have a thriving timber industry. It collapsed. No jobs have replaced a lot of that. So we also have the top 2 counties in the state for opioid-related deaths. So we have a lot of issues here that are not being addressed by our current representation. And additionally, with the Green New Deal, he just refuses to support it. He refuses to stop taking fossil fuel money. And we just don't have much time. We only have until 2030 to make big, bold change to the economy and getting it to renewable energy. So that's why I decided to run.
Wow. The sad thing is I hear these stories over and over, and they always shock me, but they're all very similar. When you hear about who's representing us in the House, who's coming out of these traditionally very Democratic districts, and it's really mind-boggling. Because Washington State is probably like more, I would say, populist in terms of at least electoralism. So it's horrifying that you'd have a legislator, a lawmaker who would be taking such conservative positions. Now your background, tell us about where you come from, what you're going to bring to the table when you're elected to Congress.
Yeah, well, I grew up moving around overseas because my dad was in the U.S. Foreign Service, and we moved back to the States when I was 12. And I grew up moving around a lot. That's what I was used to. But when I moved to Tacoma, I really fell in love with it. I felt like I finally found my home and where I wanted to be. And while I've been here, I've done stuff like I'm a commissioner on the Tacoma Commission on Disabilities, co-led my local Indivisible group for a year and a half. I was a court-appointed special advocate for kids in foster care in my county. And I've been really involved in lots of different ways. But after 2016, I wanted to move beyond what I had been doing politically, which was voting and paying attention, but, really get more involved in the process. And that's when I found out so much more about our district and how out of touch with the district's needs and also just Democrats in Washington, our representative is. I'm also a renter. I would be one of the few people who's not a millionaire and not a homeowner in Congress. And so I can really relate to the huge increases in rent. I mean, Tacoma, it may surprise people to learn, we're not as expensive a rental market as somewhere like New York or San Francisco, but out of everywhere in the country, we're one of the top for the rate at which rent is increasing. So it's really severe, the housing crisis here, and government is just not doing enough to solve it. And then in the rest of the district where there's more home ownership, there just isn't enough rental stock. And, Aberdeen in my town, that's where Kurt Cobain, Aberdeen, which is a town in my district, it's where Kurt Cobain was from. Has a population of 16,000 and 1,000 homeless people.
Wow.
So you just imagine 1 in 16 people are homeless. That shows you the scale of the problem. And they just, yet there are empty houses all around Aberdeen. And that district, that county, it also is one of the top 2 that I mentioned, the state for opioid-related deaths. And they don't have a single treatment facility that takes Medicaid. So people literally die because of that.
Not a treatment facility that takes Medicaid?
Mm-hmm.
In a state that's led by, are you kidding me? Wow.
Yeah. And unfortunately, out of our delegation, Pramila Jayapal is amazing.
Yeah.
Some other representatives are good on certain issues, but we really don't have the progressive representation that really matches our our politics. Bernie Sanders took this district in 2016, very close second in this cycle. We also have a long populist history in this district. There were about 10 IWW chapters in the state. There was local socialist organizing in Aberdeen, which I just mentioned. There were a lot of socialists organizing there. There was a socialist hall. You can even see a picture that a local historian tweeted of 500 socialists gathering together in 1911 in Aberdeen, the local socialist club. There's a long 100-year plus history of populist left-wing organizing in this district. And people ask me, well, what about the conservative voters in the rural parts of your district? Well, if you ask a lot of them, even the Republicans, their favorite politician is FDR. And that's because he was the last president to visit their communities, and because there were 7 civilian conservation corps camps on the Olympic Peninsula. So the federal jobs program, people want these populist policies.
That's fascinating. I mean, the Northwest has had this, the longshoresmen, like it's where so much the roots of so much of our labor has, radical labor transformed our country. Also has, there's also horrible history from FDR that, is on the table as well. We have to mention that. But, it is refreshing hearing you openly talk about socialist ideas, and it's not coming from Queens or parts of Brooklyn, and even at the state level. I live in Queens. We have a very active Queens socialist DSA membership. But with that being said, they sometimes even DSA members will speak in code when running. You're not. And how has that? You say there's Republicans. How have they responded to your just open DSA membership, all of the history that you talk about? How are they responding to it?
A lot of people don't know about that history, even though many of them probably have a father or grandfather who was a wobbly because of how many locals there were. And but people also remember, there were horrible Union massacres in this area, right, and they remember the history. And so when I talk about it in that way, where it's homegrown, it's part of our history and our tradition, and I'm just going back to our history and tradition by coming with these populist policies. And I also, when I'm talking to people, over a year ago, I was out canvassing in Aberdeen with a local group that's trying to make sure the Green New Deal benefits rural Washington and not just cities. And we didn't say anything about Democrat, Republican, DSA. Right. We were just talking about the Green New Deal. And have you heard of it? Here's a little bit about it. And then we showed them a list of policies and asked which of these would be most important to you to have part of the Green New Deal. Stuff like jobs guarantee with family wage union jobs, a free education so you can get trained for new jobs in the new economy, childcare, all the parents are working, or both parents, more parents are working, we're going to need childcare. So a list of policies like that. And people who voluntarily told us, we didn't ask, they told us they were Trump voters. They would look at this list and say, well, I don't know, it's hard to choose because I really like all of these policies. And so if you just come to people and you talk about the policies, how it'll impact their life, right, and do it that way, and they don't feel like anything's being pushed down their throat, or that it's not partisan. When people ask me, well, how do you work with people across the aisle? That's a common question. It's just, well, I'll work with people across the aisle when it doesn't mean compromising my values. For example, cutting Social Security is an absolute no, and I will never cross that line. But there are things where if you look at certain bills, you'll see that basically the Squad and Justin Amash are the only people who voted in one area of it, and it's usually around privacy.
I was like, let me guess.
And so there are certain issues where I would have something in common with a libertarian like Justin Amash, and that's where I would vote with that person on it. So there are ways to work across the aisle that don't mean going Republican corporate light. Yeah,
it's interesting. There was this old concept, at least in the 2000s, when John Kerry got annihilated, that all the Democrats and all these new organizations that popped up that were left-leaning said, we got to meet people where they are. They understood that there was a disconnect happening, and the communications trainings were always find out where that voter is. But we do live in this extremely polarized, intentionally polarized, strategically polarized country that brings profits to not just the media, but to all these organizations that pop up to defeat the other side. And so on one hand, it seems like we're further apart than we've ever been. But then when you talk about these populist ideas, that's the great unifier. And I think what you're saying is can be duplicated wherever you are. If you're in a big city, if you're in a rural community, I mean, people just want to have a fair shot at life, and they see that government and whatever they want to point fingers to is not providing it. The root is often what is to be debated. But do you find that when you talk to folks and you kind of get them in that circle, you meet them where they are, sometimes they think that like, okay, well, maybe what Donald Trump says is the problem, and you say, well, actually, it's really this instead. Are people open to that switch about what the root problem is?
Yeah, that's interesting. That's something we walked through when we were doing this Green New Deal canvassing. We would start by saying, hi, we're doing, what's your, ask about cost of living, basically. And like people would say, well, housing is too high, or can't afford to send my kids to college, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And we'd say, well, who do you think is responsible for that? And then give some suggestions. And then they would, well, our landlords, or, Walmart not paying us enough, or stuff like that. And you can talk with people like that. And what's really interesting is that, for example, Grace Harbor, where Aberdeen is, it went for Donald Trump in the 2016 election. That was the first time it had gone Republican in 90 years. And wow. Yeah. And the centrist corporate Dem response is we need to get even more centrist in corporate Dem and Republican light. But that is not what they want. And I've looked at the results for this year's primary, and there are precincts in Aberdeen where all these precincts are right next to each other. This one, Bernie, Trump, Bernie, Trump, Bernie, Trump, Bernie, Trump. Why is that? Is that because Bernie went more Republican and became Republican light? No, it's because Trump presents himself as a populist. Bernie actually is a populist. What they want is populism. And so it's just that they want somebody who's addressing the root problems in their life. And so I don't find an issue around that. And I think a real problem that Democrats have as well is that they look down on people often. And it's just kind of, the more educated you are, the better of a person you are, and you know what's best for people. But people actually know what's best for themselves. And I actually read an article that poverty went down during the coronavirus pandemic. So shocker, it turns out that when you give people money, poverty goes down. I mean, I don't need a PhD to figure that one out. Yeah, and like people who have just a high school, they have a high school education, or they have an associate's degree or something. Like they know what's best for their life. They know what they need. They need money and a job and an education and a house to live in. And so you do not have to come at them with this kind of looking down on them or deigning to speak with them. Lots of people who we call, or before the pandemic we were canvassing, never had a politician come to their door. And I know what that's like because no politician ever comes to my door. The only people who come to my door are salespeople, missionaries, and a mail carrier. So,
which we, hopefully we'll still have that after this election, the mail carrier. So let's just talk a little bit about the election before we wrap up, because I think we have to ask these questions. We're in COVID. Your primary is on August 4th. How are votes going to be cast?
Well, we're fortunate here because we already had mail-in voting, and there are a few polling places, mainly for people with disabilities, so that they can use a machine that they can actually use to vote. But really, the vast majority of it is mail-in. There are drive-by ballot boxes. Here, progressives tend to vote at the last minute, which kind of like, is a stressor for people. That's how Sarah Smith in the last cycle, she ended up, getting over at the last minute. But so essentially, it's mail-in. So I don't think we're going to face a lot of issues. Like the system here is very well run. We also have same-day voter registration. There is no party registration, right. So we have pretty high turnout. So things are looking really good there. We also have a top two primary, like California, if people are familiar with that. So what that means is that everybody will run in the primary against each other. And for me, that's 4 Republicans, the incumbent Democrat, and me, all running against each other in the primary. And the top two vote getters will advance to the general. In my district, in the last two congressional elections, the Republicans got exactly 32.7% of the vote. When it was one of them, he got that amount. And when there was more than one, their vote total added up to that.
Wow.
So that seems to be their base. And with 4 of them running, they're likely to just split their base. So things are looking pretty good. It has been a challenge with the pandemic, not doing any canvassing, but we have already made 300,000 phone calls to voters. And we have people all over the district and the country, up to 50 phone bankers a day. And so people are really resonating with the message, and we're doing really well, especially because our 24% of our district on Social Security and the incumbent signing a letter calling for Social Security cuts. I mean, our base is what you would think of for a populist DSA person running for Congress, with the addition of seniors. They really support our message. So I'm excited.
What is the turnout usually like in terms of numbers?
Very high, like over 100,000.
Woo.
Yeah.
So just to put that in perspective for folks who are paying attention to these races in New York, looking at the numbers, nowhere near that. I mean, granted, I should say that the mail-in votes have not been cast yet, but primaries, for the most part in New York, have been fairly low turnout because of our restrictive voting laws that have just recently changed. Alternatively, Washington State has pretty strong voting laws in terms of open primaries, and now you have the jungle primary, which it's questionable, but you have the California system. But I mean, it just shows you the difference. Like in some of these races, I think 25,000 people showed up total. In some of the local races, I looked at some of these state Senate races, 3,000 people voted total. So to see a vibrant primary like that's pretty great. And I think that bids well for, hopefully, knock on wood, wherever that is, for a populist.
Yeah, I hope so. And
found the wood.
People are really open to the message, and I'm excited. Voting starts on July 17th, so it's coming up really quickly.
Great. So how can people help out if they want to join your campaign in any way?
You can donate. I don't take any corporate PAC or lobbyist money. Go to RebeccaForWA.com, click on the red donate button. Any amount helps. My average donation last time I checked was $17.
Awesome.
You can also volunteer. Go to the events page. You'll be taken right to the sign up to volunteer. If you've never phone banked, don't worry. We train you, provide you with everything you need. You don't use your personal phone number. You just do it from home on your computer. And that would be a great way to sign up and help us as well.
Great, Rebecca. Best of luck, and we'll be watching you very closely.
Thanks.